Hi, Sal. So tell us a little bit about your book and the journey that you underwent before you started the Khan Academy, which led you to writing this book.
Yeah, well, the book is, well, it's a little bit about that journey, but really how that journey kind of informed what Khan Academy has now become, and then how that could inform what maybe classrooms could become or what learning could become, and not in just a kind of a pie in the sky kind of way, but I know this is really happening, and it really feels like we're at this kind of this inflection point in what's going on in classrooms. This whole adventure for me started somewhat, actually very inadvertently. It was 2004. I was working as an analyst at a hedge fund at the time. Just gotten married, family from New Orleans visiting me in Boston after my wedding, and it turned out this one cousin, Nadia, was having trouble, 12 years old. I had trouble believing that, she, extremely bright girl. We shared a certain amount of DNA too. and when I asked her about it, it was actually her mom who told me, and I asked Nadia about it, and she said, "Oh yeah, I'm having trouble with units." And I said, "Well, let me tutor you." And I think she thought I was just bluffing. So I said, "No, we're going to work this out." So she went back to New Orleans, got on the phone. We ended up using some tools on the internet so that we could see each other's scrawls, initially with a mouse, and then we got these little pen tablet things. And long story short, she went from being a struggling student to catching up with her class and then becoming a somewhat advanced student. Actually, I joke I became a tiger cousin at that point. I called her school and I said, I really think Nadia needs to be and retake a placement exam.
Right.
And they said, "Who are you?" I said, I'm her cousin. But then I started tutoring her brothers, and fast forward 2 years, word got around free tutoring was happening. I was tutoring 10, 15 family, friends, cousins, and it was at that point that and the firm I was working for, it was a firm, but it was my boss and his dog and me. We moved to Silicon Valley, and I was telling a friend about all the stuff I was doing with my cousins, and he said, "Well," and I was complaining that it's getting hard to scale. I still had a day job, all these students around the country with time zones, and et cetera, et cetera. And he said, "Well, why don't you make some tutorials, stick them up on YouTube?" And I thought that was a silly idea. YouTube's for cats playing piano, not serious. But I gave it a shot. And, long story short, that kind of started getting a ton of traction. People started looking at it. In those early days, I also was working on this little software tool for my cousins, and so there was this view that, hey, maybe this could be an institution to help people. And so it was set up as a not-for-profit, and then in 2009, I had trouble focusing on my day job, so quit and started doing Khan Academy full-time.
Well, so tell me a little bit about the Khan Academy. What is the business model? Let's start with the big, hairy, audacious goal, which I just found very big and audacious, and then the business model that you've based it on.
Yeah, so maybe I'll go the other way around, because when I was starting all of this, and I was sitting in the middle of Silicon Valley, I came from a very for-profit reality.
Right.
I had friends who were venture capitalists. Says, "Hey, Sal, let's we could fund this, and it could be this double bottom line business or whatever that means." And there was a lot of temptation there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there was this feeling, I was getting all of this emotional reward from these thank you letters that people were sending me, and the sense that, hey, I was making these simple things for my cousin, and now, at first tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, now millions of students are using it around the world. I'd like this stuff to be around in 100 years or in 500 years. And I don't want this, this collection of software and content and this organization, I don't want it to skew from this mission of being able to reach these people. And so, when I look at other organizations in the universe that are able to do that, last many, many, hopefully centuries, and stay true to a mission, it's a not-for-profit where there is no ownership. It's a public charity, and so I said, I should set this up as a not-for-profit, not quite understanding what that is. And I remember when I was doing that initial paperwork for it, the IRS asks you, what's your mission? And I kind of thought about it for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and I said, well, a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere.
Why
So why not? Well, you never want something that you could just say, check, it's done.
Right,
it's an aspiration.
Yeah.
And it was a very delusional aspiration. At the time, I was literally operating out of a closet. But yeah, and so the business model is, we're not a business. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit, but we still have to sustain ourselves. And the way we want to, because we always want the learning side of education, we always want that to be free, because we think that's what empowers people. It's primarily foundation and philanthropist driven so far. But we do think there are ways to sustain itself in other ways, whether it's licensing content or who knows what. We're starting to explore that. Right. But we're pretty true to keeping the content free.
Sure. So how many students are you serving right now? How many instructors? Can you give me a sense as to how large of an enterprise?
So,
and what's the typical profile of someone who comes to your website?
Yeah, so those are, so the organization itself, we're 36 people, so we're still relatively small. But for us, it feels huge for me because last year we were 13, and a year before that we were 1. So we've been growing. Yeah. We've been growing fast. But in this past month, we've reached 7 million students, unique students. We've reached a total of 60 million unique, as the way you measure unique students on the web. Delivered 180 million lessons, 700 million problems have been done on the site, and it's students all over the world. It's pretty much every country in the world someone has used the Khan Academy in some way. 20,000 teachers, as far as we can tell from our data, are using it in their classes or with their cohorts in some type of way. So it's kind of crazy. And I call it it's surreal for where it came from.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how a classroom or a school can use you. This concept of a flipped classroom. Explain that to our viewers.
Yeah, and I'll do two things, because this flipped classroom has somewhat been tied to Khan Academy, and it is an interesting idea, and it is, I think, a forward step. But part of the whole point of this whole book was to show people, we're not necessarily about the flip. We're actually about pushing the envelope even further than the flip. So in a flip model, right now at home you do problems traditionally. That's called homework, and in the classroom, a lot of time in a traditional classroom is spent lectures. And the flip is, and it predates Khan Academy. Early on, I had these videos out there. Some teachers were telling me, hey, you made a decent video on meiosis or on projectile motion. I don't have to give that lecture anymore. My students can watch it at their own time and pace. They can remediate without taking up class time. And then when they go to class, that's when they can either ask me questions, clarifications, and we can do problems together. So it used to be homework. The problem sets could now be done inside the classroom. And the advantage there is the real learning occurs when you do the engagement, when you're doing the problem sets. And I think traditionally students either don't do homework or have trouble doing homework because there's no one at home to help them out. Now they're in the classroom. They have the teacher. They have their peers, which is an underutilized resource in the classroom. Not only to help you, but when you help others, you learn a lot better. And it also gives the teacher a lens on how the class is doing. When you're lecturing, it's very hard to know where people are. I mean, you might be able to poll them, ask a few questions, but it's very hard. A lot of times the students are a little bit, blank faces. Right. But now if you're doing problem solving together, you can do much more, you can understand where students are and diagnose them. And so that's the flip. It's what used to be homework in the classroom, what used to be lectures are now at home. It makes the classroom interactive. Students can get lectures at their time and pace. Great. What I focus on a lot in the book is, let's go even further, because still, even the flip assumes that all the students are going to cover the same material at the same pace together. And what I talk a lot about is this, we've all been indoctrinated in the system. And when I talk about the system, I'm not talking about, what should be the student-teacher ratio or what, charter or private or public. I'm talking about the system. I'm talking about grouping kids by age-based cohorts. They cover certain subjects at a set pace. We grade them based on their variable understanding, and then we keep pushing them forward. And we just assume that's what school is. But what I go through great lengths to show is, no, this is actually a relatively new phenomenon. It's about 200 years. I mean, it's not that new. It's 200 years old, but we inherited from a country that no longer exists, the Prussians. And, in fairness to the Prussians and even to us, I guess, it was this, during the Industrial Revolution was the first time that people seriously thought about how can we educate everybody. Before that, it was, you're the son of a lord, and you would get a king, and you would get a private tutor, and the private tutor was the gold standard. It was, they're working at your pace, they're differentiating it for you. But now all of a sudden, in Prussia, there's like, okay, we want to have mass education. How do we do it in a practical way? And so, well, it's the Industrial Revolution. Well, how do we do anything in a practical way? We stick them on an assembly line, and as they go through, we kind of do something to the product, and then hopefully at the end we have a decent product. And so they essentially applied the same model to classrooms. The kids are in these buckets based on age. You know, and it's funny, I was talking to a friend, and her child already knows how to read and everything, and she was trying to get the child into the kindergarten. You know, he's like born in October or something.
Oh.
And the school said, oh, you know, he's a very bright kid, but, you know, we can't, he's too small. And I told my friend, and she came back, she's like, yeah, he's too small. I was like, look, if that's what they were concerned about, they should be grouping them by size.
Right.
That's
right.
it's the obvious, natural, but so that's the model. And so and even the flip is in the context of that model. You have, you know, on week 3, we cover parabolas. Week 4, we cover systems of equations. And even if you have we give students grades. We give them a B, and that B shows that they have a gap in their knowledge. A C, even a D, you can get on an exam, but then you move to the next topic.
Right.
That's usually building on top of that, which is pretty much dooming you to failure.
Exactly.
And so what I advocate strongly, and we're already seeing this in schools starting to experiment or move in this direction, is if you take lecture out of the classroom, there's no longer the need for everyone to move together at the same pace. And as soon as you get rid of that assumption, you can completely rethink what a classroom can be. You can start having everyone learn at their own pace. You can leverage class time when humans are together for actual interactivity. You can start to say, well, why do we only have one teacher in the room? Why can't we have 2 teachers in the room? Why do we have a bell ring? And this bell ringing, this is like a factory, in a 19th century factory. Why do we have a bell ringing that's saying, stop what you were doing on chemistry, you must now start English? And we all know, anyone who's done anything creative, that's the best way to stop creativity.
Right.
Is to say, you have exactly 55 minutes, and then you're done. And so what we're advocating is move to a reality possibly with the help of tools like Khan Academy, so that every student can learn at their own pace. Teachers have dashboards, tools that empower them, and that use class time for interactivity and creativity.
Right, right. You touched on this a little bit, but explain a little bit about why is it that your platform has taken off and is getting so much attention when so many others who are kind of trying to do the same thing on the for-profit side, some on the nonprofit side, haven't succeeded?
Yeah, it's an open question, and it's a question that we're constantly asking ourselves, just because we don't, whatever the secret sauce is, we don't want to lose it somewhere in the process. My best guess of why there was this initial wave of traction, from 2006 to 2000, and even it continues to grow, is those first videos. I think it was fortunate that it was just some guy making it for his cousins. I think
so they were easy to use.
They were easy to use. They felt very human.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the big learning is that people were hungry. I wasn't the first person to make videos on YouTube. Right. I wasn't the first person to think of teaching. As soon as radio came out, people were saying, "Oh, we'll use this to teach the world," and then TV, "Oh, we'll use this to teach the world," and VCR. Now it's on demand. Right. But historically, it was either a videotape of someone at a chalkboard, traditional class, which feels it feels distant even when you're in the classroom. Right. You're there, I'm over here, the next step in the equation, and you do it like that. Right. And so that's not very, and when you make that in a video, it's even harder to see, what are they writing there, and I can't hear them. And these felt very personal. You're sitting next to me. I think the other dimension of it is just the conversational tone. It's, I think a lot of people, they try to make it very polished, which is not bad, but in that process you lose the humanity. So it sounds like your GPS system. The next step in this equation is when, and I think hopefully this is something that I try to put into it, is one of the things that I think allowed me to do to kind of thrive in math or science and eventually even finance was I felt like I had a really holistic understanding of things, and my basics were really, really, really solid. And then, my basics in algebra were really good, so when I went into calculus, I was like, oh, this is intuitive. Right. And when I went into, corporate finance, I was like, oh, this is intuitive. There's nothing new here. Right. And you see other really, really smart people, they're just learning for the next exam, memorizing formulas, then they forget it, and then when they see a related concept, it's like, what's this? And so what I tried in those early days for my cousins is give a sense of intuition, draw the connections between things, so that when they see this new concept, it's not some random new concept, it's connected to everything they learned before. Right. And I get a lot of letters, and I would have assumed that would have only been appealing to the motivated kids, so to speak, but I get a lot of letters from kids that were traditionally disengaged or demotivated, and they said, that's why I was demotivated. No one was explaining the why. Right. Well, no one was giving me the connection. So hopefully that's why people have been, I guess, connecting to the content.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about virtual education and offering the types of things that you're offering. A lot of people are still a little wary of these reforms. They see it as a mechanism to ultimately get rid of teachers in the classroom or reduce class sizes. You talk a little bit about this in the book, and explain that a little bit.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a super important point, because whenever, when we've learned in the last 15, 20 years with the internet, whenever people see virtual X,
a robot
it's like, is that going to replace the physical? Barnes and Nobles versus Amazon.com. There's a natural contention there. That's exact opposite of what I think is going to happen in education. Everything we do is not going to replace a physical school. I have young kids. I want them to go to a physical school. Right. I want them to get interaction. What it will do is, I think, give all of our children the experience that I think every parent and every teacher or every student wants to be a part of, is that even now we're going to a physical experience, but we're not leveraging the humans. We're going, but for the most part, people are sitting passively there and they're listening. And it's hard for the teachers too, because you're not, it's hard to just speak for 60 minutes without getting that connection with the students. And so what we're advocating is leverage tools so you can get maybe information delivery out of the way, so you can get some of the problem solving out of the way. But so when people go and they have class time, the scarce class time with other human beings, that's optimally interactive. And not interactive in the web sense, interactive in the human sense. So class time is all conversation. Class time is all peer tutoring and working with the teacher. Class time is all doing open-ended projects. And so, I talk about this in the book, and I gave a TED Talk a bunch. The irony here is, I strongly believe, and it's not just talk again, we're seeing this in classrooms, is that you can actually use technology to make the classroom more human. And I'm very careful. You mentioned there's skepticism. I think there should be. I'm skeptical when someone says, hey, we just ordered 500 iPads for our school. And I say, well, what are you going to do with it? Or how are you going to integrate it into curriculum? Or how are you going to leverage it to fundamentally transform what's going on? And there usually aren't a lot of answers there. And so I think it is good to be skeptical, but at the same time, there is, I think, a reason for hope.
And so how do you evaluate the impact of your courses? Since, again, you talk a little bit about grades in your book and how you don't like the concept of grading. How do you know that they have actually worked?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, a lot of times, when I grew up, I remember I sometimes would meet people who say, I don't believe in grades, and I thought they were these kind of like, granola bar, hippie-type people that, and now I think I appreciate what they were saying. Grades, normally when you say people who don't like grades, you usually think they're being touchy-feely, they're not being rigorous. But actually they're saying grades aren't rigorous enough. Grades are this thing that give this feeling of rigor. Oh, A, B, A's, oh, you really know your stuff. F, you don't know your stuff. One, they're somewhat arbitrary. Depends on the test, depends on how it's measured. Right. But even more than that, when you give grades, especially in the sense, if you got a C on an exam, you have obvious weaknesses. Assuming that it was even a good exam, you have obvious weaknesses. And so that should be used as an assessment to say, okay, you need to now improve on those weaknesses. Before we move on to a more advanced topic, look, it's common sense. Get your basics down. But instead we use grades as a value judgment. You're smart, you're dumb, you're fast, you're slow. And that's just going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what we say is, no, let's just make sure everyone masters every concept. So rather than having a superficial understanding of algebra and then moving over onto trigonometry, make sure you really understand algebra deeply, and then trigonometry is going to make a lot more sense. It's going to be a lot easier to learn. And if you master trigonometry, then calculus is going to start seeming very intuitive. In terms of how we're doing it, we're working with schools, famously Los Altos, which is now using Khan Academy. It's probably one of the best, if not the best, school district in the country, is using Khan Academy for 5th through 8th grade as one of the tools that they use. And there we have formal studies going on to understand exactly how this is impacting students and teachers, both objectively on things like test scores and grades, but also on things on subjectively. Are the teachers more excited about their work? Are the students more excited about their work? And then on top of that, we have 3 million problems done a day on our site. We have this huge number of students, 7 million a month using our site. So we have this treasure trove of data on our site itself. And so we are building an analytics deal all the stuff that all these other web companies are able to do, we as a kind of education not-for-profit can now do, using analytics, optimizing for engagement, seeing what kind of learning is going on.
Great. So tell me a little bit about, so you gave a great historical overview of how we came to educate students today, the way we're educating them. Did you always hold these views and know this information before you stumbled on the Khan Academy or the this platform that you created, or were these things that you studied afterwards? It just so happens that everything flows so beautifully. So
it's been very
I was curious as to what came first.
It's been a combination. I actually think it's more of the latter. Obviously all of us have spent a lot of time in the system. I think the whole time, anybody who knew me growing up, they knew that I was always like, why is this way? Why is this that way? Wait, why can't I tutor? I used to get reprimanded for trying to tutor I was like, no, why? This would have been a really positive interaction. Right. And so there's this question, and then you go to college and you're like, wow, people are sitting in this lecture hall. Is anything really happening in here? It seems like all the learning is happening when they're the cram session, 3 days before the final. And so there was always these ideas. And then obviously when I started working with my cousins, I started seeing that my cousins were motivated. They were, for the most part, good students. But they were having these huge gaps in their knowledge. They weren't learning things intuitively.
It's called Swiss cheese learning,
et cetera. And so I, in a very pragmatic way, started building these tools. And it was really a process of discovery, of teachers emailing me saying, hey, we're using it this way, we're using it that way. And so it's a combination of these instincts of like, well, how did I learn? How do other people I know who learn things holistically, how did they learn? What am I seeing with my with my cousins? What are teachers telling me? And then as Khan Academy got more and more traction, I started having people tell me about a lot of this stuff. I knew a little bit about the history before. I'd heard about this whole, Committee of 10 and 1890. Someone had told me about that in high school. But it was interesting that, and even the research. The original reason why I made the video so short is because YouTube limited me to 10 minutes. But then I used to have researchers telling me, no, there's actually cognitive research that shows, and that's what that's where a lot of that research from the book comes from. That like actually people, for especially dense academic content, can't pay attention for more than 10 to 15 minutes. And so it starts as, wow, so why are we doing these? Why are we using class time, this time with human beings, for these hour-long lectures or sometimes 90-minute lectures? Can't we get people to interact more? And the more I did research, a lot of these kind of just basic common sense ideas gelled with research, and that's when you feel best about it because they are common. It's weird when research tells you something very non-intuitive, but here it's telling you something very, very, very intuitive. And the only kind of hard to grasp thing is that we're indoctrinated into a strange model. Right.
Now, it all makes sense. So tell me a little bit about your own education. Something, despite the regimented system that you grew up in, something must have gone right. Was it a teacher? Was it your parents, you think, who kind of built this sense of inquisitiveness? And or was it, did you go to a particular type of school that was open to nurturing you as an individual and paying attention to your specific needs? Did none of these things work?
Yeah, no. I'd be delusional, although I am sometimes delusional if I were to say that if none of that stuff played in. I think there was probably two. There's probably a bunch of different factors, and I'm probably forgetting some of them. One, I was blessed to have an older sister who was a very good student. So I think that projected, when I would walk into a classroom, the teachers would remember my sister and say, "Oh, you're Farah's sister, you're Farah's brother. Right. You must be." And I was like, I was like in speech therapy and stuff when I was. But they would project that, and there's actually now studies that show that projection has huge implications for your own self-esteem. So that was luck. On top of that, I went to I would say it was a public school in Jefferson Parish, public schools in Jefferson Parish, right outside of New Orleans. I would say it was the average American public schools, all of them, elementary, middle, and high school. But there were some incredible teachers there. I think in high school in particular, Mr. Hernandez, Miss Kennedy. Miss Kennedy was a journalism teacher. And actually, I would say that's where a lot of the idea is that, look, class should not be a lecture. Class should be working alongside the teacher. It was journalism class. So we had a product, a creative product, a newspaper to work on. I was the art editor, and she would give us feedback, and she was like our senior peer. And I remember those interactions. And a lot of the experience that I got from journalism, I still think about when I'm working on Khan Academy. I think early in my schooling, I think this was key and also lucky. I got into, I don't know what they call it now, these GT programs. And what they did is, you have this very structured Prussian curriculum for most of the day, but then one day a week they take you out of a different classroom and they take you into these GT classrooms. And there, you go into this classroom, which is essentially the kind of classroom that I ideally everyone should have, where you have this it was actually Miss Roussel and Miss Krause, these two teachers, and they had PhDs in education, and I remember the first day walking into GT, and Miss Roussel said, "So what do you want to do?" And I was like 8. And I was like, "I like to draw." And then she says, "Well, you should draw more then." But she would introduce me to these things, different styles, different tools to draw. What else are you interested in? And I was like, I like puzzles. And she's like, well, here's some puzzles. And she would give me these brain teasers. And so she was mentoring me, and it was self-paced. And I was able to go at my own pace. And there was other kids working on interesting things, and I would get inspired by them. Sometimes we would work on things. And I think we needed that breathing room to have. I wonder if I didn't have that experience early on in my life, whether I would have had the ability to kind of self-direct or had the ability to kind of say, oh, let me solve that problem. No one, that's an interesting thing to tackle.
Right. So along those lines, do you have any advice for parents out there, first graders, second graders? And I'm asking you this because in your book you also highlight how a lot of students in Southeast Asia go to school in order to show off what they know, not necessarily to learn in school. So are there habits that you think parents can start to put in place early on, despite how the schools are approaching education?
Yeah, and take everything I say with a grain of salt. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, so maybe I should be getting advice from the parents of 7 or 8-year-olds. I'm trying to get my 1-year-old off of a pacifier.
Well, now that iPads are very popular.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, my sense, having kind of gone through the system, and even we're working with a lot of teachers, we're working with a lot of schools now. I would say there's a couple of dimensions here. I think it is true. Asians, whether it's East Asian, South Asian, there is a culture of school is where you go to show what you've already learned at home. Right. And I think that gives those students an advantage of having this kind of buffer of they're learning stuff maybe ahead. And I'm not saying that necessarily has to be the way, but that is a way to ensure that your student in the Prussian model doesn't get, falls behind. And as soon as they fall behind, all of these negative kind of self-perception things, and they start to reinforce each other. So I would do, I'll tell you what I would do with my own children. I would do some combination of engaging them with a lot of the content in a way before it becomes stressful. So when I was teaching Nadia algebra when she was in algebra class, it was stressful for her because she's like, I need to catch up, I have an exam on it. When I started teaching algebra to her younger brother, who's in 5th grade, he thought it was fun. Because there's no stress here. It was just a fun thing his cousin was teaching. So at least expose your kids to the ideas in algebra and physics and biology and chemistry early on, so that when they see it in school, they've already had some exposure. The other thing I would say is don't overschedule them. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes the same parents that would, do the teaching ahead of time, at the same time will also, you have piano lessons, you have soccer lessons, you have everything. And I think there's a value there, definitely. But if it's complete overscheduling, you have the loss of time for the child to develop their own creativity. Kind of what I had in that GT class. So, frankly, in the 80s, I was a latchkey child where, my mom was, she worked these odd jobs and would come home at 6 or 7 o'clock. And so me and my sister would just hang out, and some of it was wasted watching TV, but a lot of it was just like, I want to build something, or I want to draw, or we would like make up games and stuff like that. And kids need that. They need that free space. And maybe if they're blowing it all on video games or watching TV, you need to push them a little bit or do something creative with them.
Right.
But they need that time for creativity. And the last thing I would recommend is that the parents themselves engage in learning, because you set that example. If you're 40 or 50 years old and you're going back and learning algebra or cosmology or English lit, it's a huge signal for students.
Right. So let's talk about your vision for the ideal classroom, or this futuristic vision that you outline here about what the school of tomorrow should look like, which is a lifelong learning approach to education. You also talk about the college of tomorrow ought to look like. I was fascinated by this. But let's talk just about schooling. Your notions of class size, the ideal classroom could potentially have 100 students in it with 4 instructors roaming around and helping students. You talked a little bit about grades already, but testing. This is one of those topics that comes up a lot here in Washington and with the discussions on Capitol Hill. But how would you, describe that vision for us? And you also talk about how you would get rid of summer vacations, which is probably not going to be popular. But let's dive into this a bit.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. The first dimension is, once you remove lecture from class time, you say class time is a time for interaction, you could have students working at their own pace, allows you to rethink everything. And so a lot of the concepts in this book, and a lot of these are happening. There are schools that we're working with that are doing these things. They are experiments, but they're experiments that all the research and all of the intuition point in that direction. Teaching is, for the most part, a solitary profession. You're the only teacher in the room.
It's a lonely
It's lonely. It's lonely. And so you could have 100 students. You're not changing the student-teacher ratio. You might even improve it, but you now have 4 teachers in the same room. Now, if one of them gets sick, students don't have a substitute teacher. Different students are going to connect with different teachers. They can mentor each other. They can do group things with teachers together. So there's a whole dimension that you can add. You could have a physics teacher, a math teacher, a chemistry teacher, and a biology teacher all teaching simultaneously. So students understand that all of these sciences and these maths actually blend together. They're not these like siloed subjects, so they get a holistic understanding. The tests themselves, you need some aspect of testing, but you should be very skeptical of testing, because all tests measure what they test.
Right.
And there's many more facets to a human being than that. And so the dimensions that, there could be some testing to make sure that students are getting core competency and some core skills, but the more important skills, which I think are completely unmeasured right now, are creativity. And you can never give someone a creativity score, but you can have someone generate a portfolio of creative works. I mean, we, as an employer, we're hiring engineers, and when we get these people great GPAs from top schools in the country, and we say, so what have you created? That's what engineering is, building new things. And they haven't created anything because they've been on the treadmill the whole time, just trying to finish problem sets, and they're very, very smart people. And so the ideal is that students over their careers can show what they've created. It's not like they write a paper and it gets graded and gets thrown away. They write a paper, maybe it gets graded, and then they keep working on the paper. They keep developing it. When they're 18, they have a novel done. They have a bunch of papers on policy done that they can show people. This is my work. They have computer programs written. They build robots. And on top of that, and this is another dimension that's completely missed in the Prussian model, so to speak, is as I think in any field, the people you want to work with the most are the people who have deep subject matter expertise, but are also always willing to help others. And they have that communication and that ability to empathize. And in our current system, we make everyone very focused on themselves. What are your grades? Are you going to pass a test? Cram for the next exam. And in the model that we're describing, we're starting to see it in a lot of schools. Let's focus everyone on each other. So yeah, you go at your own pace. You might be racing ahead, and that's great. You're stimulated. You're engaged. But you also have a chance to re-engage with some students who might be having difficulty. And there's two things. One, you're going to be helping that student. But even better, when you explain that, hopefully, and you develop your ability to explain, you'll learn the material better, and you'll learn to communicate. You'll learn to empathize. And that actually is measurable. I mean, you can have students rate each other. You can have people write assessments for each other. Oh, he understood the stuff, but he was a little bit, he spoke a little fast. And you could develop that aspect. And so I'd imagine the transcript of the future, and I say the future when I mean the future is like actually now, you would have your test scores. Your test scores would actually show actual competency. It wouldn't be grades. It would be like, I understand algebra, and I've renewed it.
Right.
I've renewed that I know algebra well. I know cosmology. I'm a writer. Here's my writings. You have a portfolio of your creative works in multi-dimensions, and you have reviews from people that you've helped, saying, great person to work with, really understood the subject matter, really was able to communicate well. And those are the things that I think anyone would actually care about more than just test scores. Right,
but let's talk a little bit about what happens in this classroom or school in terms of subjects. So you believe that, right now there's, you have to take math, you have to take English language arts, you start science at a certain point in time. Do you believe that all these basics should also be taught in the school? And at what point, another question I wanted to ask is, do you believe that all children can learn unless they have a serious disability? Can they all progress to the levels that you have progressed to if they simply learn and master and show an interest really in the subject matter that they are that they're studying, and specifically vis-a-vis the STEM fields, which science, technology, engineering, and math, which are areas that kids tend not to get interested in? Is it just because they haven't mastered it well and been pushed to understand it early on, or are there limitations perhaps in how we are currently trying to get students to learn these subjects?
Yeah, so on the latter question, if you asked me 20 years ago, I would have said, maybe certain people are predisposed to math and science and other people aren't, and that made me feel good because I was one of the people who were predisposed. It made me feel like I was meant to be there. It wasn't luck. But my experience with my cousins, Nadia in particular, but other cousins, and then what we're seeing in schools, the schools that are kind of transitioning to this type of a model where all the students are learning at their own pace, building their foundations, we're seeing, day 5, some kids have raced ahead. Those are the gifted kids. Right. And some kids are falling behind. You're like, maybe they need to be remediated. And in a traditional model, you would separate them. And you would actually tell these kids, you're smart. Exactly. And you would tell these kids either explicitly or implicitly, you're not as smart. But what we're seeing is if you keep them together, but you allow them to work at their own pace so that they're engaged, they have mentorship from each other and the teacher, many times it's actually quite hard to predict. We're trying to predict it. It's very hard. Some of these students who are falling behind, maybe it's an algebra class, and some of them didn't know multiplication well. Some of them didn't know how to add fractions. You give them that opportunity to really build that foundation on negative numbers, multiplication, exponents, whatever it might be, and then these kids race ahead. So it was not, their problem wasn't that they had some cognitive inability to understand algebra. Right. The problem was they're sitting in an algebra class, and for some reason, they didn't understand how to multiply, or they didn't understand how to add fractions, and then you're just going to feel silly in an algebra class, and you'll disengage really just to protect your own self-esteem. So I'm actually now more and more convinced that pretty much everyone, barring certain exceptions, could, we don't know where, I mean, we're still learning, we don't know, but progress far ahead. And we're even seeing it, in these classrooms. We traditionally think motivated kids, maybe that's 20% of kids. But as soon as you allow people to engage and fill in gaps without feeling embarrassed, you start seeing it's not 20%, it's 80 or 90% of kids can start to feel engaged. In terms of the first question about like what subjects and how, I think it is an interesting, and I talk a little bit about it, is, the subjects that are taught now are somewhat arbitrary. They were decided in 1892 by the committee of 10 male university presidents who did not know about, this was before the Federal Reserve existed, the interstate highways existed, knowledge of DNA, and, a bunch of other stuff. And they decided that, at age 14 you should learn algebra, at age 15 you should learn geometry, at age 16 you should learn trigonometry, so you should learn physics your senior year in high school, you should learn, that's when it was decided, and it hasn't changed since. And I love all of those subjects. I think they're all fascinating. But I think there are obvious questions, should there be more statistics? Is statistics more valuable than calculus, or at least as valuable? Should there be some knowledge of economics? Who knows what it'd be? I mean, it's for society to decide. But the general idea is, at minimum, it should be rethought within the last 120 years. There is grounds. The world has changed. We should think more about what these subjects are. And even more, I think, and you alluded to this, should they even be divvied up in these siloed subjects? These siloed subjects, we're indoctrinated into it, so it's hard for us to break our minds from it. This is the factory model. This is, you're at this machine in the factory, and so this is what will be poured into the product. Okay, now you're going to have the paint applied to you. So now you're going to have the chemistry applied to you. Now you move on. Now you're going to, and for some people that might chip a little bit, that's fine. That'll be a cheaper product at the end. But the reality is chemistry is halfway in between physics and biology. And physics is halfway in between chemistry and pure mathematics. And all of them actually have an aspect of philosophy to them. All of them have an aspect of aesthetics to them and whatever else. And writing can be critical, and logical thinking is across all programs. You could have something like logic, which is across everything. And so I think the reality we're moving to is, yes, you will show competency in things. Say, yeah, I understand this domain well. So you can go take an exam and then renew that exam to show that, yes, I still understand that topic. But while you're in school, some might be preparation for that particular competency, but most of the time will be blending it, where you're not working to pass an assessment, you're working to create things. And so in the process of creating things, whether it might be a novel or a robot or a business, you're integrating all of these things. I mean, anyone who started a business, if you're starting a tech business, there's art, design, there's technology, there's quantitative thinking, and there's writing, and there's just human skills. And you need to integrate it. That's what actually matters in the real world. And so when you break yourself from this assembly line model, you give yourself the freedom for people to pursue these type of things.
Right. So why not create a Khan Academy charter school, or even a Khan Academy private school?
Yes. So it's
I'm sure you've thought of it at least.
Yes. No, I mean, we go back and forth on that, but we're thinking about it. We're thinking about it. I mean,
and where would you put it? Which country would you pick to?
Well, for selfish reasons, I would probably put it in Mountain View, California, which would be maybe walking distance from. No, but seriously, I think, it's interesting because, and this shows the emphasis we put. I think a physical experience is incredibly, incredibly important. A lot of people in Silicon Valley say, well, you're at scale already. You're reaching 7 million and you're growing. You're doubling every year. You could reach 100 million students in 5 years, maybe 1 billion, and why are you even thinking about the physical, or why are you thinking about physical schools? And I would say, well, that's because that's the core. And I also think you need you might say, well, why focus on one school that might be able to reach a few hundred kids when you're able to reach 100 million maybe one day? And the idea is if you can show examples of this, and there are schools that have already moved in that direction. Los Altos has moved in that direction. Summit Prep, which is a charter school, they've broken down walls. They have multiple teachers teaching classes in these kind of epic environments. If you show examples of this, then I think that's what moves the dial forward.
So how much would be the tuition?
The tuition would be,
I was looking at Avenues, the new school in New York, $40,000 a child.
Well, that's the interesting thing.
And it was built without this book and a vision behind it, right? It's a lot of marketing.
Well, no, the money is fascinating. Education is someone asked me recently, can you ever spend too much on education? And to some degree, the answer is no. I mean, it's such an important thing. But at the same time, if you're going to spend that much money, you have to think seriously about how you're spending it. And I've met with some, officials about this, and at public level, charter, private schools. And I just do, regardless of school, I say, how much do you spend per pupil per year? If you ask a private school, some of them, $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. You ask a public school, some states it's as low, it goes down to $5,000, $6,000 a year, but most states, especially on the East Coast, it's $10,000, $15,000. New York City public schools, $18,000 a year. Cambridge, Massachusetts, $25,000 per year per student. And I say, okay, and what's your average class size? And they'll usually say some number between 20 and 30. I said, okay, private school, you're charging $30,000 a year. That's 20 students. That's $600,000 per classroom. That's essentially for the what's directly impacting the students? The teacher, the classrooms, and maybe the textbook. All I can figure out is maybe there's $100,000, $150,000 being spent there. Where's the other $250,000 or $300,000? Same thing at any level. Why can't we instead use we can lower, the private school, I think for $10,000 a year instead of $40,000, $10,000 a year, you have 20 students, or let's say you have 30 students in a class. That's $300,000 a year. I say pay the teacher $150,000. Make teaching, a lot of people pay lip service to, teaching should be on par with doctors and engineers and lawyers. I was like, well, yeah, that's nice lip service, but if you really believe that, pay teachers the same as doctors, engineers, and lawyers. That's the best signal to society that you actually value it. But the money's clearly there. And then it'll have to get cut from all the stuff that's not impacting the students. All of the, I don't know. Every time I ask this to people, I just do this back of the envelope calculation. I mean, this is what I used to do in my old career. I used to speak to CFOs, say, oh, you're making this much, what am I missing? And the same exact question. $15,000 a year times 30 students is $450,000 a year. Mm-hmm. The fully loaded cost of the teacher is less than half of that. Plus the where is that money going? Right. And so I think you could do a very good model for what public schools are spending. Definitely some of the more, the systems that are spending $10,000 plus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about how Bill Gates came to discover you. And I just thought that chapter was so interesting. And yeah, I mean, what was it like to find out all of a sudden that Bill Gates was watching your videos, and what went through your mind?
I still wake up in the morning sometimes wondering whether that was all like made up or a dream. Of right. The site had already gotten traction, but in summer of 2010, one of our first donors, Ann Doerr, started sending me text messages that Bill Gates was at the Aspen Ideas Festival, telling the whole audience that he uses a site that he thinks is great called the Khan Academy, and he uses it with his kids and he uses it himself, which made me a little nervous because those videos for Nadia. But then and I didn't know what to do. I was like, do I reach out to him? I mean, I don't think he's listed, or but he's but then his 2 weeks later, his chief of staff called and said, you might have heard Bill's a fan, and I was like, yeah, I heard that. And they said, if you're free, we'd like to fly you up. And I was looking at my calendar; it was completely blank. And I think I could make some time for Bill. I've got to cut my nails, but other than that, my schedule's flexible. And I went up and really articulated this. At the time, it was mainly the videos I was doing. But I was like, look, if we could get some resources, and I was dreaming about a 5-person team and some office space. That was the dream at that point. We could build out the software that I started doing with my cousins, so students can get practice, they can get feedback. We can start building a community on the site so that students can help each other. We could build dashboards for teachers so that they could use it to diagnose students and leverage class time more effectively. And him, and then later Google as well. They were strong believers in that.
Great. So you talk a little bit about talent and creativity in your book. and we talked a little bit about this earlier on, but do you think, in the advent of all these, not advent, but since, a couple years ago, there were books focused on talent. Talent is overrated, the talent code, you name it. So, and I've read all of them myself, as I have a 7-year-old who I'm trying to foster into a talented individual. Do you think talent and creativity are things that can be, in fact, taught to children, or are they?
I don't think they're. I'm not sure, and frankly, I think no one is sure.
Mm-hmm.
My sense through both observation and just even seeing what's happening there is it's not something that's taught, but it's something that can be untaught. It's not something that it can be fostered or it can be suppressed, both talent and creativity. And I actually think I think everyone is born with creativity. I mean, there's not a 2-year-old on the planet who, if you introduce a new object into the room, will not walk up to that object and manipulate it in every way, taste it, feel it, see what they can do with it, pour something. There's not a 2-year-old on the planet. There's not a 5-year-old. Actually, most 5-year-olds will still, a new object in the room, they will engage with it. A new idea, they'll ask questions about it. But then something happens where they're taught to become more passive. To some degree, they are in an environment where questioning is not always cool. They're so overwhelmed with work, whether it's soccer practice or homework, that there's no time for them to kind of just think about something. The class is moving on. They can't think about, wait, why am I carrying the one? Why does that make sense? This seems just like a formula to me. They don't have time for that type of stuff. And so all of these things fall from this idea of just breaking from this Prussian model, breaking from this one pace fits lecture. As soon as you take that out, now all of a sudden you can start saying, hey, why can't we let a student, right now, if there's a 16-year-old someplace in the country who has just some insight on, like, well, maybe cancer can be addressed, and maybe this is what cancer is, and too bad. The bell's going to ring, or they have an AP test the next day, or they have an exam. Like, oh, well, I have too much work to do. I have, I quote an admissions officer in the book talk about she was interviewing a bunch of people who were coming to a very elite college and said, what do you daydream about? And one student said, we don't daydream about anything because it doesn't help us to get into college. And that's tragic. It's tragic actually for that child, but it's tragic for society because it's those daydreams that eventually lead to actual. I'll tell you, Khan Academy exists to a large degree because my boss at the hedge fund, in a very non-traditional for that field, had a strong belief in life-work in balance, and so I had time to daydream about the Khan Academy. And my wife was a resident, medical resident, so I felt bad sitting and vegging and watching TV, and so I was able to think about this problem and make resources. And I think anyone is capable of doing that. We just have to give them the time and the breathing room to do it.
Especially now, since it appears, I don't know if this was in your book or I heard it from Tom Friedman. I mean, most of the jobs of tomorrow are going to be jobs that are going to be created, not jobs that currently exist.
Yeah, no, exactly. If you go, the Prussian model started in the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, we needed probably more educated people than we needed in kind of an agrarian civilization. You needed people who could read the directions and have the discipline of the assembly line and all of that. But there was a certain passivity that you also had to inculcate. In the farm, there's a certain independence and freedom to it. All of a sudden in a factory, you're doing this over and over again. And, one can debate whether it was explicitly done, but there was an element of instilling that passivity and indoctrination so that people could be good workers. But now we're in a reality, before the pyramid was like this. You needed a few knowledge workers who were doing creative things, and then you needed a mass of labor. Now the pyramid's kind of inverted, where we need a lot of creative people. In fact, all of the real careers now are creative focused and open-ended, and you need very little physical labor. And in that reality, we're training people for this while we need we need the opposite.
Right. And so, since we are in the nation's capital, do you have any advice for Congress or the president? How can they best help bring this vision to life, understanding that?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question because we do meet with state officials and federal officials and even in other countries, ministries of education. And the one thing that I don't want to happen is, right now it's been a very grassroots, grounds up thing. People have word of mouth, Khan Academy, people have been using it, parents have been telling parents, teachers have been telling teachers. And that's good because that's way these are people who want to make it work and they figure out and they tell us ways to make it work better. As soon as you make it top down, I think it becomes it becomes, no one likes it anymore. And so we want this to be very grassroots. Whatever I tell people is just tell people about it. Tell people at minimum they have a free tutor. Tell teachers that, look, there might be another model that you probably will enjoy more. There are ways to reach more students. And on top of that, and I'm serious about this, I think they should set an example. It's too easy now in our society for people to say, oh, I'm not good at math. And they'll say that about like 6th grade math. Oh, I don't know, that's math, I don't understand it. No one will say, oh, I can't read at a 6th grade level. Or I can barely write. No one says that. But people say, you'll hear politicians say that. You'll hear CEOs say that. You'll hear people in the press say that. And I think that messaging should change. And frankly, the only way that it could change is if they directly engage with it. I mean, it's shocking how many people are engaged in education policy where they don't know the subject matter themselves. They're like, oh, I'm not good at math, but this is how we should test math teachers. It's like, that's crazy. You yourself should engage in the content, or get a depth in the content, and that'll be a huge signal to society, and I think it'll also help inform policy. And I think the more they do that, they'll realize that it's a lot less about top-down, a lot less about the controls. You know, the controls that they do, every iteration of ed reform is just about more controls on teachers. And it might de-risk some of the weaker players, but it also handicaps all the rest. And so it kind of gets to this kind of culture of, you know, everyone getting to mediocre. And what we need to really do is go the other way, have it be much more grassroots. And what I point out in this book, that's an American thing, that we're a country that's focused on creativity. We're a country that's focused on people taking ownership over their lives. But our school system is a Prussian one that's about passivity, one that's about authority. And everything about this book is, let's make our school system more American.
Yeah. So any final thoughts? If you were sitting with President Obama, you know, at the White House, aside from asking him to use his bully pulpit more,
I'm somewhat serious about it. I would ask him to, this is a somewhat different dimension, but we talk about this in the book. I would ask him to make content for us. Because I think what's happening right now is the public discourse gets so disjointed in these 30-second sound bites that you can't have a chance to go deep on either side of the aisle. And right now, you know, the main adult learning happens on the 24-hour news. And it's in these 30-second sound bites. So no one really understands the issues, and it just becomes very emotionally charged. And this form factor, this way, it's a chance for Obama to really explain why he makes the decisions he does. And maybe the opposition to really explain why, and get to and diagram it out, and even have a quiz afterwards to make sure that people are retaining it. And it would kind of fill in that gap in learning that, frankly, people are creating. Some of our most popular videos are about credit default swaps, or the healthcare plan, or the difference, you know, the electoral college. These are gaps in people's learning, and adults of any age want to learn that.
Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure reading this book. It was nice meeting you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, no, it was a pleasure. Yeah.